Today I'm going to demonstrate gallery wrapping a piece, and actually I need to flip the painting over briefly to see which way I have it oriented. I always like to know where top and bottom are before I start, and then I'll just jump right on in. So this painting is one for my upcoming show. Here is the painting, and I want to have the top facing towards me. It's going to be face down on the table, but I want it facing towards me while I start this process so that I know where the top is. In fact, I'm going to move this little label that just says the size and name of the painting over here, so I know this is the top. And the very first step is I use a hockey brush, which just absorbs water really well. This is just plain old tap water. I generally work with water that's cold or room temperature. And the painting is already mounted on this board, and now all I'm doing is wetting the edges. It's about 2.5 inches sticking out from every dimension. So all the way around it's about 2.5 inches wide. And that's the paper that I'm going to gallery wrap around the stretcher bars. Now I work on watercolor paper, not on canvas. This is in fact a watercolor painting. It has gotten a couple of coats of just a spray varnish to kind of make sure that while I'm doing this process the painting's not going to bleed, because a little bit of water will no doubt creep underneath the stretcher bars. And I like to give it as close to a full 4 minutes for the paper to kind of get wet. And watercolor paper has a large cloth content in it, cotton cloth, and so it becomes very pliable like cloth, but it needs a little bit of time to kind of seep in and really get in the pores of the paper. But while that 4 minutes is going by, I do a couple of things. One, I sit my stretcher bars on top of the platform that the painting is attached to. Stretcher bars are in essence the same size as that platform, and I place it so that the curved part of the stretcher bar is face down on the back of the panel, so that the flat edge of the stretcher bar is what I'm going to be stapling to after I wrap the paper around it. Now, there is one other step that I should do. So I use a pair of just plain old scissors, and what I do is I cut off the extra volume of paper at each corner so that when I go to stretch the paper and make the corner, that extra bulk won't be there, because otherwise you end up with a very lumpy corner that's just really not appealing. So I go around to each corner of the painting and I cut off that excess corner. And then I will do the stretching. Okay, so a few basics. When wrapping the paper around the stretcher bars, you really want to do all the folds so that the folds are on the top of the frame and the bottom of the frame, so that if someone is looking at the painting on the wall, they really don't see the folds. It's just a smooth edge on the sides of the painting. That's one reason that I want to make sure I know the orientation of the painting and that this is the top of my painting. Okay, so I have two different staplers. This one is a little bit lower power staple gun. This is a higher power staple gun with heavier staples. I usually like to try to use the lower one because if for some reason later on I decide I want to take the paper off the stretcher bar, it's easier to get these staples out than the heavy duty ones. But the boards themselves and the stretcher bar vary quite a bit in terms of how hard they are. So sometimes the smaller one just isn't going to have enough power to staple in the bars. So what I'm doing right now is I'm making sure that this stretcher bar is evenly centered on the mounting board. And then the first thing I do is I come to the center, approximate center. I mean, there's no exact measurements going on here, of the top. Now that did not go in very well, so I'm actually going to pull that one out. I'm not going to give up on this lower power staple gun being able to do this stretcher board, because sometimes you just really have to make sure your staple gun is at the best angle. So that went in pretty darn well. And I do have a hammer. I'd like to use this one that has a ball peen end on one end and flat on the other, so that if it's sticking out further, I can use the ball end to kind of partially finesse that staple in. And because this is a long edge, I'm actually going to do a couple staples on this edge. Now, you can't see what I'm doing here on this side, but I'm actually pulling the paper up as tight as I can so that it's very snug against the stretcher bars, and there's no little sagging of the paper. And those, I'll be able to finesse all of those in. I then go to the opposite side, because I'm really still being very paranoid about, am I really in the center of the board? And I do, based on how that sounded, I have a feeling this is a harder board, but I'm going to try that again. And then before I go too far, I want to also bring the other two sides up in the center and get it attached. Now, again, I'm feeling to make sure I really am in the center. At this point, I have very few staples in, and if I needed to make an adjustment so that this is perfectly well square with the board, I could do that pretty easily now. If I got a lot of staples in here, it's going to kind of be a mess trying to get things off and staple properly. So both of those went in pretty well. Alright. Now, since I'm going to be folding into the long sides, the top and the bottom, it's not always the long sides, just depends top and bottom of your painting. I'm going to go ahead and staple the sides, and I'm spacing these roughly at 4 inches apart. Later I'll come back and put another staple in between these so that they end up being about 2 inches apart. But at this early stage, now my process I have found works best if the last staple on this edge is about 4 inches from the corner. And in this case, I'm going to put in one more staple. This has just been, experimentation over time to see what works best. So and keeping the about 4 inches from the corner. Oop, we just ran out of staples. Alright, so let's reload the staple gun. And for this staple gun, they just go in the back end, and then you put this back in place to hold them in there. Oops. But of course the pointy edges are face down to the bottom of the stapler, because otherwise they're not going to staple. Okay, so back over here. Two more staples, and then also you need to continue to work fairly quickly. I'm going to slide this out a little bit just to make sure it's in the view. And I'm going to continue on the other two sides at about 4 inches apart. That one did not go in very well. And now you can, I hope, see that I'm kind of stretching the paper up. That's good. I'm just using a small pair of needle nose pliers to pull those staples that didn't go in very far at all back out. That appears to be a fairly hard spot. These sides are actually made from 3 to 4 different pieces. You can see the junctions, and this particular piece might just be a little bit harder piece of wood. So I will go back and forth between the different staple guns to, and even though that's more than 4 inches, I'm going to leave that like that, because I will be folding the paper into that edge. Sometimes it helps to have a little bit more room. It's sticking out a little more than I'd like, but okay, so I kind of finessed it in with the ball end of the hammer, and then was able to get it in the rest of the way. You'll see that as my hand gets tired, I start to do the two-handed hold, because that seems to keep the staple gun at a little bit better angle. You really want it pretty much parallel to the board, and that one I was a little off at an angle, and it didn't go in very far. Yeah, that one's not great either, so this is not uncommon. It's you can see there's just a lot more pressure with that one, but these being the heavier duty staples, they go in so well, then they're pretty hard to get out. And now I don't find too often that I need to get them out, but occasionally I do. So I do tend to use the more standard staple gun that's not quite so heavy duty. Yeah, this panel's not quite so heavy with this stapler. That one will be pretty well. This one I'm going to nudge in a little bit by just hitting at the ends probably can't hear me when I'm hammering. I'm just hammering with the ball end on the ends of the staples to kind of help finesse them into the wood. Not the prettiest staple in the world. Okay. So, next step. I'm going to try to turn this in hopes that I have this well in view of the camera. And then remember, this is the top. So the first thing I do is I take the paper, which has gotten very pliable at this point, very much like cloth, and I push the corner in. And you can see that corner, I try to get it very, very tight against the edge of the stretcher bar. And then I take the bottom piece and see how it's laying against it, and it looks like it's laying pretty close to that corner. And what I mean by that is this edge, although it angles in just slightly from the corner, it's not like way over making a funny angle. And then actually I'll use the heavier duty staple here and staple that in place. Now, I will be coming back all the way around and putting another staple in between these other ones, but I don't need to do that immediately. So let me do another, show you doing another corner. So now this is the bottom of the painting, and we want to fold this corner into that bottom. So again, I fold it in, and I do kind of a lot of massaging of the paper to try to make sure it's really nice and flat. I then kind of manipulate the bottom piece so that it's pretty close to that corner. There is this little tiny tab that's sticking up here. Usually I press that to the back of the stretcher bar, which is the top as we're looking at it right now, because we're looking at the back of the panel, and bring the other bigger piece over it, and then staple right in the corner. And I do, like I did on the other corner, like to then come right in right away. Oops, that one did not go in well. Working around a corner like that is not ideal. Let me turn this again so I'm a little more straight on. And I do like to get, I'm going to use the heavier duty one. I don't like to do too many holes in the paper. It is going to get varnish, and those holes will get sealed up. Actually, I'll just go ahead and use this to do this one too. So again, we're not doing perfect measurements. These are about 2 inches apart, and I'll go ahead and do this one too. I always feel the staples after I put them in, and if I can still feel a ridge on them, then I staple them in, and I hammer them in to make them good and flat with the surface. And the corner ones, because there's enough volume of paper, you often don't have to hammer those. Of course, I said that, and now I feel that this one is sticking out a little bit. Alright, so let me go do the other two corners. And this is the top, so I fold into the top. I'm really careful about what would be the bottom edge as we are right now, but it's going to be actually the edge right next to the painting to make sure I have a really nice crisp corner there. If you don't get that nice and flat, then it kind of bulges out and looks a little strange from when you're looking at the front of the painting. Neither of those went in real well. I do have a tendency, once I'm pretty far along on doing a piece and know that I'm probably not going to have any reason to be taking it off, to switch to the higher power staple gun. Alright, one more corner. Again, I'll move this so that you can see what I'm doing. This is the bottom that we're folding into. Now, I could have used one more staple. Oh no, there is one there. Never mind, I didn't see it for a minute. Alright, so, nice crisp corner. This is pretty straight, parallel with the edge. So I like how that all looks. I fold the little corner down first. I'm pressing fairly hard while I do all of this to try to get as good a crisp corner as possible. And then staple it. And one more here. One more here. And now I'm just going to work all the way around and make sure all of the staples are about this distance apart. That one's a little bit bigger gap, but that's still close enough to 2 inches. This one I'm going to fill in. I do have a tendency that I'll staple a few and then I'll come and flatten them with the hammer so that I don't forget and leave them sticking out. Certainly no reason you can't just staple everything and then come back and hammer. And it now looks like all 4 sides, I've got them approximately 2 inches apart. And there's the painting from the front. You can see these corners are really nice and tight. This painting will, after this is dry, go through additional varnishing. Right now it only has very spray varnish that's on the watercolor paper to keep it so that during that whole process things didn't run. I'll come back with liquid varnish and do 3 more coats of varnish, well sometimes 2, often 3 coats of varnish with a liquid varnish on this, and that will seal it up, protect the paper and the paint from anything. It's an ultraviolet protective varnish, and so it protects the colors from fading, although these are all what's called high permanence colors, so they're not likely to fade anyway, but it just gives it another coat of ultraviolet protection to keep any sunlight from potentially causing any fading. And then it also protects the paper and the paint so that really moisture can't get through to it. I do hope that that will help you quite a bit on how to do a gallery wrapped, in this case watercolor. I also use it for my fluid acrylic paintings that I also paint on watercolor paper. Thank you.